Well, in a previous webinar, I talked about Patrick's early life from 1923 to 1939. And in this webinar, I'm going to concentrate on the wartime years. Now, just to quickly look back at one or two things which are important about Patrick's early life. I discussed his influences as a teenager, that he'd become interested in astronomy at the age of 6 when his mother had bought him a small book by G.F. Chambers on the story of the solar system. And he was hooked. And he was an incredibly dedicated individual and very passionate about astronomy from a very early age. When he was only 11, he obtained his first telescope, a 3 1/8 inch refractor, a Broadhurst-Clarkson instrument. And you can see it here in the garden of the house at East Grinstead, where Patrick and his family moved in 1929. Now, of all the influences in Patrick's early life, William Sadler Franks was very, very important. Franks was a well-known astronomer. He was a very experienced observer, and he was extremely disciplined in logging and recording all of his observations in hard-bound notebooks. And this was a discipline and a skill that Patrick inherited from Franks and carried out throughout his life. Now, Franks was the astronomer in charge at the Brockhurst Observatory, which was also in East Grinstead, in the grounds of a large country estate owned by a wealthy businessman, F.J. Hanbury. When Franks unexpectedly died in 1935, shortly afterwards, Hanbury invited Patrick to look after the observatory. It was one of these things where Hanbury would have guests to dinner and would take them down the garden, a very large garden I might add, to the observatory to show them a few things through the telescope, and Patrick was the person responsible. So he became an observatory director at a very young age. Now, this picture of Patrick, which is from May 1939, just a few months before war broke out, shows Patrick at the age of 16. With the outbreak of war and the death of Hanbury, the Brockhurst Observatory fell into disrepair. Patrick did try to buy the wonderful brass Cooke refractor that was in the observatory, but was unable to raise the money to do so. And so his subsequent observations throughout the wartime years were carried out either with the naked eye or binoculars, or with his trusty 3 1/8 inch refractor. Now, when war broke out on the 3rd of September 1939, Patrick, who kept diaries like this throughout his observing career, this is what he wrote on that day. 1939, September the 3rd, beginning of the Great European War. Consequently, a permanent blackout, which is helpful for observations. So he's looking at the positives there with the outbreak of war. Now, in 1940, Patrick made a series of observations of the planet Saturn, but I've put the observation that he made in 1940 and late 39 with the ones that he made previously. So here is a whole series of drawings beginning in October 1935 when the rings are closing, and then we have the edge-on ring perspective in late 1936, very early 1937. And then the rings are slowly opening again. And you can see that by 1940, September there, you can see just about a year after the outbreak of war, the rings are now opening rather nicely. So Patrick is making these drawings with his fairly small telescope, but he's beginning to refine his craft as an astronomical observer and draftsman. Now, in the early stages of the Second World War, the government set up the Local Defence Volunteers, or LDV, but the name was very quickly changed to the Home Guard. And Patrick, as a youngster, only, of course, 17 years old, was enrolled into the Home Guard. And here you can see Patrick in that time, in 1940, in his Home Guard greatcoat, part of the East Grinstead platoon. Now, his father, who was a Military Cross decorated veteran from the Great War, became the platoon commander. And there is Patrick on the left with his father, Charles Trushell Moore, on the right, the platoon commander. And I'm instantly reminded of Private Pike and Captain Mannering. And whether their relationship was anything like that, I really have no idea. Now, Patrick was not only in the Home Guard, but they very quickly realised, the local people in charge of the Home Guard platoons, that Patrick had a great knowledge of the night sky. And this was going to be extremely useful. So even from this early stage, Patrick would go round to other platoons in the area and give talks about the night sky. They were interested in what people might see in the night sky that they might mistake for a flare or something that would indicate a German bombing raid. And so Patrick's knowledge and skill was widely sought. He became also an ARP, checking that the blackout was enforced throughout East Grinstead. Now, an interesting event occurred in October of 1940. And I want to read from Patrick's notebook because it's quite interesting what it says. 1940, October 11. Inspected the crater caused by a bomb that fell last night in a field about 500 yards from Brockhurst, though the German radio no doubt claims that it fell on an important military objective. The crater is about 12 feet in diameter and 8 feet deep, really very like one of the small lunar craterlets. When it fell at 2 a.m., it made a great explosion, heard for many miles around the district. 4 photographs were taken of the bomb crater. Now, what is interesting about that statement is that not much later, in the later part of the war, Patrick would say at a meeting of the British Astronomical Association in London that he was firmly of the opinion that the lunar craters were largely volcanic in origin. And this was a view that he held for most of his life. And yet, in October 1940, he had stated quite clearly that the crater he had seen had been proved and caused by an exploding German bomb. And of course, we now know that most of the lunar craters are of impact origin. And it's interesting to know why Patrick, having got that early heads up on the formation of craters, formed such a very widely different view. Now, as I say, the Home Guard, the ARP work that Patrick did, not only involved him in giving talks to local groups to tell them about the night sky, but he was also involved in a certain amount of training. And one evening, there was a training exercise going on, and someone came rushing in and saying, "There's a bright German flare falling, maybe there's a bombing raid coming," and everybody was panic, panic, panic. Patrick went out and proudly proclaimed, "It's the planet Venus." How could anyone mistake the planet Venus for a flare from the Germans, he thought. But there you are, that's Patrick all over. Now, we can see that Patrick, in the early parts of the war, is carrying out his observations with his small telescope. He's also doing a lot of naked eye and binocular work. But let's have a look at the last really detailed lunar studies that Patrick did for most of the war. These are some drawings he made of the moon in the summer of 1940. And you can see there that he's drawing the Mare Imbrium, and he's drawing small craters and craterlets in that region. And he also, you can see, also later in 1940, he's doing some much more detailed drawings. over on the right there, you can see some really beautiful sketches that he's made of the area between Ptolemais and Walter, and showing quite a lot of the larger craters and the smaller craters and craterlets. Again, he's beginning to learn more about the skills of becoming a good astronomical draftsman and turning what he sees through the telescope into a very fine sketch. You'll also notice the copious notes that he makes. This, again, is a skill and a discipline being inherited from the great W.S. Franks. And Patrick there is noting all lots of different things that he's seeing in those lunar features. And this was, again, very important. You can see in the previous example where I showed you the sketch of the Mare Imbrium, again on the left there, he's got lots and lots of details about the appearances of craters, about ray structures, about features that he can see, both bright and dark features. And this is part of Patrick learning his way around the moon. And as we know, the moon was going to become his great passion, and he was going to be director of the BAA lunar section for many years in later life. But here we're seeing that he's building the skills of a great lunar observer and the knowledge of the lunar features. Now, on the 1st of January, 1942, Patrick goes and signs up to the RAF. So 1942, January the 1st. This is the entry he wrote in his diary. I went today to Euston House, where I was accepted as a pilot in the RAF and formally attested. Consequently, it looks as though I shall be unable to do much observing after the coming spring. Being a volunteer, I shall be called up as soon as there is a vacancy for me. It is interesting to note that I was accepted in spite of my short sight, which will necessitate special lensed air goggles. So he's signed up for the RAF in early 1942 in the Volunteer Reserve. And here you can see the first entries that he makes in his notebook of his travels around the country in his early years in the RAF VR. You see, he starts off in July, on the 13th of July, 1942. He joined the RAF as a trainee pilot. And you can see there the various places that he went from, starting off in St John's Wood, Ludlow, Cosford, Stetton, back to Cosford, then a bit of leave in East Grinstead, then Ludlow, and then down to Paignton in Devon, where he would join the initial training wing and start to fly. Now, we have a couple of pictures of Patrick in those early years when he's first joining the RAF VR. Is a picture of him taken in 1942, looking rather smart there. And of course, his mother, very proud, and here he is standing with his mother in the garden at the house at East Grinstead. And you can see he's a pretty tall young man, bearing in mind he is only 19 years old at this time. Now, Patrick went down to Paignton, as I said, in the autumn of 1942, and he kept a series of small notebooks. They were the sort of notebooks which I used to use at school for spelling and vocabulary. I'm sure those of you who are a similar age to me will know the sort of notebook I'm talking about. Well, he kept these throughout the war. There were 3 of them. They were his wartime observing notebooks, and he recorded everything. And you can see here a couple of pages from his time at Paignton in Devon in October 1942. He moved to Cosford at late October 42. But you can see there a very interesting record there for the 21st of October 1942. And bear in mind, he's in Paignton in Devon. Aurora Borealis by 5:30 was quite noticeable, extending in a concentration in the direction of Leo, past Beta and Delta, and reaching Alpha. Small stars like Sigma and Rho Leonis registered in its were much reduced in apparent brilliantly. Small stars, yes. So he's basically saying that the aurora was bright enough to dim some of the fainter stars in the constellation of Leo. So that's an interesting observation of the northern lights from somewhere as far south as the southern part of Devon. But bear in mind, of course, with the blackout, the sky would be very, very dark to the north. Now, you can see here that Patrick goes to Cosford on the 25th of October. Now, what is interesting is that something happens in late October. He befalls some accident. We do not know what that accident is. And we were unsure of exactly whether he was hospitalized or not until shortly after Patrick's death. A lady wrote to the trustees of the Heritage Trust and sent this very interesting piece of paper. It's from Ward 5 at the Cosford Hospital on the 30th of October 1942. And you can see there are all sorts of RAF personnel in the ward, which they call the mental ward. And you can see that among the signatories there, halfway down on the left-hand side, Patrick A. Moore. And there is no doubt that that is our Patrick, but why he was hospitalized and what happened, we do not know. We know that Patrick had a number of accidents during the war, some of them flying accidents, some where he may have fallen off his motorbike. We don't really know exactly which this was, but certainly he was hospitalized at that time. Now, by the end of 1942, he'd headed back down again to Paignton in Devon, where he joined the initial training wing, A Flight 1 Squadron, where he was doing his training for aircrew. And you can see Patrick standing right in the middle of the back row. And you can see already he's taller than just about everybody else in that picture. And here we have another picture from the same period. And Patrick here is second from the left in the back row. Again, not looking quite as tall in that one, but nonetheless, you can see that there are some of his fellow trainees in that time. Now, throughout Patrick's time, when he was training with the RAFVR, as I said, he kept these notebooks of his observations. And I'm going to go through one or two of the sample observations of things he was doing at that time when he was doing his early training from Christmas 1942 right the way through to the summer of 1943. And first of all, we can see that he observed a lot of variable stars. These were generally bright stars, some of which could be seen with the naked eye, some of which could be seen in binoculars. And you can see there on the right there a list of the variable stars that he had under watch and the number of observations that he has made of those particular stars. And again, you can see that here we have a summary of some observations from the early part of the war, or beginning just before the war in January 39. And you can see there, again, Patrick's attention to detail, the date, the time, the clarity of the sky, and the estimate of brightness. This is the star Epsilon Aurigae, a very unusual eclipsing variable with a period of 27 years. But one of the stars that Patrick observed a great deal throughout his entire life was the star Betelgeuse Alpha Orionis, a red supergiant star in the constellation of Orion, the top left star, as you look at it, an irregular variable, as I say, an M-type giant. And here we can see, beginning well before the war, some estimates of Alpha Orionis. And here we are, I've skipped a couple of pages in the log, and you can see observations being made through 1939 into 1943. And you can see that he's recording the brightness as generally somewhere between about magnitude 0.3 to 0.8, with most of the estimates being around 0.6, 0.7. And it's interesting that the faintest that he records here is about magnitude 1. He would have been absolutely fascinated by the deep fading of Betelgeuse earlier this year, the end of last year, 2019, and early 2020, when Betelgeuse between October and February dropped down to about magnitude 1.8. Patrick did record a deep minimum, as he called it, of Betelgeuse in 1944-45, when it went down to magnitude 1.4, but nonetheless, the minimum that we saw earlier this year was even deeper than that. And Patrick, had he been alive, would have been fascinated to see that. On the right, we have some observations that Patrick made of the slow nova DQ Hercules, discovered by the meteor astronomer J.P.M. Prentice in 1934, and there are some estimates Patrick made of that star, a nova, and fading, as you can see, quite dramatically during 1935, becoming below naked eye brightness that autumn. So there we have some of Patrick's variable star observations. He also was very interested in the star Gamma Cassiopeia, and you can see here that he's recorded his observations here with the star fluctuating between about magnitude 2.4 and 2.8. It is interesting that he'd watched the brightening of the star in the mid to late 1930s and kept it under observation throughout the wartime years. Now, the astronomer W.S. Franks had, before the war and throughout his career until his death in 1935, been very interested in the colours of stars. In fact, W.S. Franks was director of the BAA Star Colour section for some years. And Patrick had always wanted to carry on Franks's work. And you can see here a page out of his notebook from the early war years, where he is still recording the colours of stars according to the nomenclature that Franks had taught him. And so he's carrying on the work of Franks, even though Franks has passed away, and Patrick is carrying on that tradition. Patrick made few planetary observations during the war. I've already said that his lunar observations were few and far between once he was called up for the RAF. He did make some observations of Venus, and this is the only opposition of Mars that he covers in any detail, and this is the opposition of 1941, and you can see there some small sketches there made with his 3 1/8 inch refracting telescope at East Grinstead, and his usual notes on the left-hand side. Apart from Venus and Mars and those early drawings of the moon, Patrick's lunar and planetary work was fairly few and far between during the wartime years. Now, in the latter part of 1943, Patrick would go off to Canada for his navigator training. But I want to mention something that happened on the 9th of July, 1943. Now, during 1943, Patrick was moving mainly between RAF Cranwell and Prestwich. We know he was at home on the 1st of July, 1943, and we know he saw the eclipse on the 15th of July, 1943. But on the 9th of July, 1943, there was an event that Patrick would certainly have been deeply affected by, whether he was in East Grinstead at the time or not, and certainly the whole of the town was affected. At just after 5 p.m. on the afternoon of the 9th of July, 1943, a lone Dornier bomber that had been separated from the rest of its group was flying over East Grinstead, and it dropped its bombs on the town. And one of those bombs hit the Whitehall Cinema. Now, that afternoon, 184 people were in the cinema watching a movie about Hopalong Cassidy. It was a very wet and dreary afternoon, and so a lot of people had gone to the cinema, including a large number of children. Tragically, 108 people died and 235 were seriously injured. Out of a population at the time of just 8,000, it was an incredible blow to the people of East Grinstead. And there is no doubt that Patrick would have been affected by it. His family would have lost friends, neighbours, as indeed everybody did in the town. And as I say, we don't know if Patrick was at home at the time, but certainly he had been at home only a few days earlier. Well, at the end of 1943, Patrick would head off to Canada for the next stage of his training. You can see here the log of where he was. You can see there that lunar eclipse on the 15th of July when he was at Cranwell there, and he's back in East Grinstead in November. And then after a brief spell in Manchester, he goes off to New Brunswick, to Moncton, to start his proper training as a pilot officer, as a navigator. And we can see here, this is an extract from Patrick's original navigator's notes made at the time. Again, you can see it's absolutely beautifully produced. Beautiful drawings, beautifully written up. He's logging all the things that he needs to know to become a good navigator in the RAF. And Patrick, this notebook is full of beautiful drawings and notes like this. This is an example of one of what he called his active service books. He kept 3 of them throughout the war years. This is number 2 for the years 1943 to 1944, and covers the time from when he left Prestwich to go off to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to New Brunswick, and then throughout his time training in Canada to when he comes back to the UK in the summer of 1944, around the time of D-Day. And it was in these notebooks that Patrick would record incredible details about things he observed. Here's the other part of the notebook taking us into the summer of 44. And on the right there, you can see all the different addresses that he held in the various places that he went. And there we can see the Canadian addresses there at the end of 1943, early to mid 1944. Well, of course, in northern Canada, you're going to be able to make lots of observations when you're at flying altitude. But Patrick, of course, as the first or the second navigator, occasionally the wireless operator, had to keep a flying log. And this is an extract from his flying log from Mount Hope in Hamilton. And you can see that he's qualified as a wireless operator in 1943, November 17th, and he qualifies as a solo wireless operator in 1944, February 25. And you can see he's flying as a solo navigator there later after that. So it's very interesting to look at the different logs that he kept, and again, meticulously kept. Now, the Northern Lights, of course, are a fantastic sight across Canada, and from flying altitudes, Patrick had many superb views of this, one of nature's greatest light shows. And I thought I'd share with you an extract from one of those notebooks on the 18th of March, 1944. And you can see he's over Lindsay at a height of 6,000 feet, and he's observing some variable stars, Alpha Cas, Gamma Cas, Alpha Orionis, Beta Leonis. And you can see there, he's also observing the aurora. He said, coming back in the region of Guelph and Gat, a very fine display of aurora borealis developed. At 22:05, two very marked auroral arches with a distinctively greenish tinge, and at 22:10, a rain was seen, passing through Betelgeuse and far as Castor and Jupiter. Unfortunately, I was too occupied with navigating the aircraft to give the aurora the attention it really deserved. The display appeared to have died down by the time we reached Gat at 23:05. Height of these observations, 6,000 feet above sea level. So he's obviously got a glance of the aurora, but he's bemoaning the fact that he's got to navigate the aircraft, so he can't give it the astronomical attention it deserves. How typical of Patrick that is. Well, he comes back in the summer of 1944 as a fully trained navigator. And here we can see a lovely coloured print from when he returns in the summer of 1944 with the prominent N in his single wing there, indicating that he is a trained navigator in the aircrew officer. And here he is in the garden at East Grinstead in his full uniform, and of course posing with his mother, Patrick with the pipe standing on the left, and remarkably someone who is even taller than Patrick standing on the other side. Unfortunately, Patrick never noted anything on the back of these photographs, so we do not know who the other gentleman is. Perhaps one of his flying colleagues or a local friend. We cannot say. But if anybody has an idea who this might be, then do please let me know. So here we have Patrick with yet another friend in the garden at East Grinstead. Again, Patrick looking imposing with his pipe and his uniform, his colleague standing there. Again, we don't know who this is, so if you have any idea, do please let me know. It would help us to piece together these bits of Patrick's wartime life. And then, in the summer of 1944, Patrick heads off to the Aircrew Officers' School at RAF Hereford, A-Wing, 3rd Squadron, A Flight. And again, there is Patrick in the back row, second from the right. And he's obviously now doing a lot more flying. He's goes into flying Wellingtons at this time. And we can see that here is a picture taken outside an officer's mess. Again, we have no idea where this was taken or who the other people are in the picture, but Patrick is very obvious there, standing just left of centre in the back row with his pipe firmly in his mouth. So with Patrick being in the Wellington squadrons, he is flying around quite a bit in Scotland. He's based in Lossiemouth and in Elgin. And here again, we can see some extracts from those lovely notebooks. And you can see there that he says, looking at the top right, at 2300 hours, an aurora was reported by my Pilot Officer Wall, who was flying over Lossiemouth at 2,000 feet. His description was green in colour, feeble arches, rays and streamers like searchlights. I myself did not see this aurora. So Patrick's enthusiasm has affected other people in his squadron, people flying other aircraft who are reporting to Patrick their astronomical observations. And then the following night, at 2200 hours, flying over Lossiemouth at 1500 feet, Patrick receives a lunar rainbow. And again, seen by myself, the Pilot Officer Wall, and the rear gunner, Sergeant Regan. And a continuous band from horizon to horizon, but no detectable colour. So again, great detail from Patrick, great attention to recording the dates and times and where he is when these events are occurring. But the real thing is, he is basically encouraging other people to report what they see. So there we have one of these auroral arcs with the narrow rays pointing up towards the zenith, as Patrick might have seen it over Lossiemouth in March 1945. We have here a picture that hung in Patrick's study for all of his post-war life. It was a picture of which he was extremely fond, and it's a crew of 6 from a Wellington bomber in which Patrick had a near-death experience. In December 1944, he'd become a flying officer, and in early January 1945, he was in a Wellington with this crew flying out of St David's in Pembrokeshire. At about just under 20,000 feet, the Wellington stopped responding to the controls because the controls had iced up, and the bomber rapidly descended to 4,500 feet, and the crew were getting ready to bail out. There were 6 parachutes, but they noticed that one of them, the ripcord, had already been pulled, and therefore it may not operate. And so they had a decision to make. Did they try and have 2 people to go on 1 parachute, or did they try and land the plane? Well, they did manage to land the plane somehow and bring it up back to RAF St David's in Pembrokeshire. So here we have the crew's part jobs: the bomb aimer, navigator, Patrick, and air gunner at the top, the air gunner, pilot, and radio operator below. And these are the names as we can make out on that picture. You can see that we can only be sure of 2 of the people: the radio operator, Guest Dempster, and Patrick himself. The others we are reasonably certain. The pilot, Andre, we believe was Belgian, and Patrick was taught a lot of French by a Belgian pilot, he would say, after the war. And Patrick became quite good at French, but he apparently always said he spoke it with a Flemish accent because of his teacher. So most of these people, if not all, are almost certainly dead by now. They would be in their late 90s, any who are still alive, but they would surely have relatives who are still around. And if anybody knows of any relatives of this crew who might be still alive, again, I would be very interested in talking to them. After the war, Patrick joined the Pathfinder Club, and here you can see we found among his effects after he died his membership card from the Pathfinder Club. And after the war, he published a paper in the BAA Journal in which he showed the deep minimum that he had recorded of Gamma Cassiopeia. The star had brightened in the mid-1930s, reaching certainly above magnitude 2. Some people say about 1.6, 1.7, and then it faded dramatically to 3rd magnitude during the early part of the war in 1939-40, and then slowly pottered about back to 2.9, but in every case still being fainter than Delta Cassiopeia, which was the comparison star that Patrick was used. So Patrick summed up all of those variable star observations. He kept observing Gamma Cassiopeia throughout the wartime years, and there is the paper he published. Now, in the 3rd of October 1945, after the war was over, Patrick was demobilized from the RAF. He officially left on the 5th of December 1945, but he was recommissioned as a pilot officer training on the 13th of June 1946. And this is the ATC, the Air Training Corps in East Grinstead, where Patrick, and you see him sitting there in the front row, is the acting pilot officer training. And he held that training post until the 5th of September 1947. Well, after the war, Patrick would become a teacher for a short period of both history and French, but his teaching career didn't last that long, and eventually he took up writing. And here we can see a picture of Patrick in the early 1950s, looking quite a dashing gentleman there. And of course, not only did he become a very well-known writer during the 1950s. He also became a radio broadcaster. And then in the October of 1956, he would make his first foray into television, producing a program called UFOs, Flying Saucers, Do They Exist? But he did such a good job on this program that the BBC spotted him and decided that he would be the person to front a monthly program about astronomy. And this became The Sky at Night, a program that Patrick would present from April the 24th, 1957 until his death in December 2012. And here you can see him on an early set in Lime Grove with the planisphere backdrop that they had in those early days. And this was eventually replaced by an orrery, which would introduce the program. But Patrick apparently lent it to the two Ronnies for a sketch, taking basically the mickey out of Patrick and the Sky at Night team. And apparently they dropped the orrery and it was never the same since. So there we have the man who became a household name, who became the voice of Apollo for the BBC, who became someone we all knew and loved. But first and foremost, he was an observer. And all of that work that he carried out throughout the wartime years, using nothing more than the naked eye, binoculars, and occasionally a small telescope, stood him in very good stead for those later programs. Patrick knew what he was talking about, and that came over. Also, he was an enthusiast. That enthusiasm had begun in the early parts of the war when he would go round other Home Guard platoons telling them about the night sky, and that infectious enthusiasm would rub off on other air crews in the squadrons he flew with during the war so that they would make observations on his behalf. Patrick Moore. What an incredible character.